Welcome to the third in this year's Selden Society lecture series and the second annual Lord Atkin lecture. The subject of tonight's lecture is Dr. Kevin O'Doherty, the Irish doctor who delivered the baby who was to become Lord Atkin. Fortuitously, serendipitously, all parties concerned in that venture had the foresight for the birth to take place just across the road in Tank Street some 151 years ago. I need not say much about our speaker tonight. He is well known to all of us. He was Solicitor General for 13 years, a member of the Court of Appeal for 5, Chief Justice of the Federal Court for 3, and since 2013 a Justice of the High Court of Australia. That history alone qualifies him to speak on almost anything. But tonight he adds his Irish heritage to make a truly formidable combination. Please welcome Justice Keane.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, on the 28th of November 1867, Mrs. Mary Atkin was delivered of a son in Tank Street on North Quay, on the site, as Glenn said, where the Commonwealth Law Courts now stand. In the register recording the child's birth, he's named James Richard, but he became famous as Dick Atkin, more formally Lord Atkin of ODoherty. As this lecture is the second Atkin oration, it's appropriate at the outset to say something about Lord Atkin to explain why we Queenslanders, who go about our lives 12,000 miles away from where Lord Atkin made his name, why we find his life a subject for celebration, indeed celebration now, on an annual basis. Dick Atkin travelled to Wales from Queensland when he was only 3 years old. He was raised there by his mother and grandmother. He won scholarships that enabled him to study at Oxford University. After graduating from Oxford, he became a barrister. As a junior barrister, he lacked connections in the law and briefs were slow to come. But Atkin's brilliance and capacity for hard work were eventually recognised. He became a successful barrister and judge. Indeed, he was arguably the most influential English judge of the 20th century. Young Dick Atkin had returned to Wales because his younger brother, the third boy born to Mary and his father, was sickly, and it was thought that he would have better prospects in the old country than in the new frontier of Queensland. His father, Robert, had stayed on in Queensland. These were the kind of harsh separations that were typical of attempts to make a life at the edges of the empire in the 19th century. Robert Atkin died in 1872, and so young Dick Atkin never saw his father again after his return to Wales. But the judgments that Dick rendered as Lord Atkin of ODoherty are suffused with the same liberal outlook that his parents inculcated within him, and a lasting adherence to the cause of the people as opposed to the interests and privileges of the rich and powerful. The very existence of this lecture series shows that Queensland lawyers are inordinately proud of Dick Atkin's Queensland origins. It might be thought that given his very brief time as a Queensland resident, it is distinctly unreasonable, even churlish of us, to claim Dick Atkin as one of our own. But we Queenslanders acknowledge no equal when it comes to churlishness. In fairness, though, the connection with Queensland was not all that exiguous. Indeed, the Queensland connection helped establish Atkin's career at the bar. By an extraordinary coincidence, the child who would become Dick Atkin's wife, Lucy Hemmant, was also born in Brisbane, within 12 days and within 100 yards of where Dick had been born. Her father, William Hemmant, had been very successful as a merchant in Queensland and returned to England, where he built a grand house that he called Bulimba. Dick Atkin met Lizzie Hemmant while he was studying at Oxford. It was at Bulimba that William Hemmant introduced his son-in-law to Norman Herbert Smith, the eponymous founder of the firm now known as Herbert Smith Freehills. It was Smith who sent Atkin his first briefs and put him on the road to success with a steady flow of work. More broadly, our geographical and historical links with Dick Atkin are but superficial aspects of the deeper, more important cultural and intellectual connections of the common law tradition. Lord Atkin's judgments remain an inspiration for all of us who share a commitment to the more humane aspects of our common law inheritance, suffused as those judgments are with an intellectual adherence to the great humanitarian ideal of fraternity. Lord Atkin's famous judgment in Liversidge and Anderson was a ringing blow for liberty and equality under the rule of law, and just as importantly for those of us who speak the language that Shakespeare spoke, for the integrity of the English language itself. But it's for his decision in Donoghue and Stevenson, delivered in 1932, that Dick Atkin is most celebrated. This great decision, in its proclamation of the neighbour principle, was a masterpiece of the synthesising technique of the common law in the service of notions of compassion and fellow feeling, which, though immanent in the common law, have sometimes struggled to be heard. The postmodernist school of critical legal studies advanced the view that the common law has developed only by decisions which deliberately break with the past. Of course, they claim Atkin as a hero, in particular because of his observation in another case that when ghosts of the past stand in the path of justice, clanking their medieval chains, the proper course for the judge is to pass through them undeterred. But in truth, the genius of Dick Atkin, and indeed the genius of the common law, is to reconcile the doing of justice today and legal continuity with justice done yesterday. Because if the decisions of today are no more than the erasing of yesterday's errors, like cases will not be decided alike, the idea of equality before the law would be betrayed, and the common law would not be worth much. It certainly would not be worth fighting for. To the extent that there was something new in the decision in Donoghue and Stevenson, it was in its articulation of the neighbour principle that unified the cases in which an obligation to exercise reasonable care for others had been held to exist. This principle has its inspiration in the deepest values of the Judeo-Christian ethic, that in many ways each of us is indeed our brother's keeper. The articulation of the neighbour principle is, it's fair to say, the most eloquent statement by the common law, always so vigilant and successful in the protection of liberty and equality, of its commitment to fraternity as well. Some Australian lawyers are uncomfortable about our ongoing reliance upon English decisions to elucidate the common law as it develops here, but even the most nationalist of them would not be so churlish as to deny the legitimacy of ongoing reference to Donoghue and Stevenson as an important legal landmark, or to decline to celebrate the continuity of the legal tradition of all the English-speaking peoples. Within that tradition, even though we may not be neighbours, we do remain brothers and sisters, and that is certainly something worth celebrating. And with that introduction, may I turn to the subject of this evening's lecture. The register recording Dick Atkin's birth records that his father's name was Robert Travers Atkin, and that Robert's birthplace was County Cork in Ireland. The register also records that young Dick Atkin had been delivered by a Dr. ODoherty, who happened to be one of the most eminent surgeons then in practice in Queensland. Dr. Kevin Izzard ODoherty had been born in Dublin in 1824, and so Robert Atkin and Dr. ODoherty were both Irishmen. But as we will see, they were very different kinds of Irishmen. ODoherty became a personal friend and political ally of Robert Atkin in the Queensland Parliament, where they both sat as Liberals of the Gladstonian variety. That they were friends was remarkable, to say the least, not only because Robert Atkin was a Protestant and Dr. ODoherty a Catholic at a time when that mattered a lot, but also because Dr. ODoherty was a convicted criminal. 19 years before he delivered young Dick Atkin, Kevin ODoherty had been convicted of compassing to levy war against Her Majesty the Queen. At the time of his conviction, Kevin ODoherty was a medical student about to sit for his final examinations. He had become involved in the Young Ireland movement and was arrested because of his co-editorship of the Irish Tribune. It was for articles published in the Irish Tribune that he was charged and ultimately convicted. In passing sentence upon ODoherty, Mr. Justice Crampton observed, "I have never read any publications more dangerous, more wicked, more clearly designed to invite insurrection, rebellion and revolution than those publications which emanated from your press and of which you have been ascertained by the verdict of your jury to be the guilty publisher." His Lordship went on to conclude, under these circumstances, the court feels called upon to pronounce upon you the sentence that you be transported for 10 years. As was his practice, his Lordship permitted ODoherty to say a few words. ODoherty said that he was influenced by but one feeling and had but one object in view. He felt deeply for the suffering and privations endured by his fellow countrymen and desired by every means consistent with a manly and honourable resistance to put an end to those sufferings. ODoherty was convicted only at his third trial. Twice before, juries of his fellow Dubliners had refused to convict him. ODoherty went on to say, significantly, that on this third occasion, out of the 12 jurors permitted to be sworn, there was not one Roman Catholic. That was history's curse, the fundamental division that made fellow feeling between two kinds of Irishmen virtually impossible. ODoherty was transported to Van Diemen's Land with other members of the Young Ireland movement. He was granted a ticket of leave in 1850 when he began work as a pharmacist in Hobart. In May 1856, he received a pardon and resumed his medical studies and qualified as a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland in 1857. Until the work of Daniel O'Connell bore fruit, Irish Catholics had suffered from legal disabilities, including their exclusion from parliamentary office, the judiciary and the executive government. Indeed, they were excluded from holding commissioned rank in the armed forces of the United Kingdom, to which they supplied about a quarter of the personnel who were required to do the anonymous dying on behalf of the Empire. And even when Irish Catholics were not under direct legal disability, they were actively discriminated against in all walks of life, except the operation of public houses and horse racing, the legacy of which remains with us today in Australia. Only after O'Connell's successors did the legal profession become open again to the Catholic Irish. Some Irish Catholics, whether out of a genuine admiration for English success in the arts of government or some more base motive, made no bones about their admiration for the British. In the late 19th century, Mr. Justice William Kenny, who tried the famous Charles murder case, which attracted the attention of James Joyce and Ulysses, was generally regarded as an impartial judge, but he was famously desperate for acceptance among the Protestant ascendancy. Timothy Healy, the leader of the bar at the Bar of Dublin at the turn of the century, said of Justice Kenny, he would have given anything except his immortal soul to be a Protestant. Kevin ODoherty was definitely not that sort of Irishman. ODoherty was convicted in November 1848. The date itself indicates that his reference at his sentence to the sufferings of his fellow countrymen was not to some general grievance about 700 years of foreign rule, but was to the circumstance that in the years from 1845, a population of approximately 8 million people had been reduced to about 5 million through starvation and emigration to avoid that fate. The British government at Westminster was pleased to call this event the famine, but as George Bernard Shaw later pointed out, one cannot have a famine if there is actually plenty of food to eat, but the government allows it all to be exported. At this time in Victorian Britain, inspired by the likes of Lord Macaulay, people were congratulating themselves on the British genius for government limited by law, That genius had previously been given a particularly rigid expression in the checks and balances of the US Constitution, which had been so designed to prevent bad government that they were apt actually to prevent government altogether. The enthusiasm for limited government may readily degenerate into laissez-faire and the exclusion of compassion from government and the loss of the ideal of fraternity. Experience, and not only the experience of the distant past, shows that the ideal of fraternity struggles for practical effect under the US Constitution. At the time when Kevin O'Doherty came to manhood, the genius of the English-speaking peoples for limited government was of no help to the millions of Irish who starved during the famine. It can, I think, be said, without any fear of contradiction, that not one of those wretched folk ever paused in his or her dying moments to express their satisfaction that the government at Westminster by which they were governed was a government limited by laws. It must be rare, if not indeed unique in human history, that the laws and governance of a country have so catastrophically failed to secure the peace and welfare of a people. It's hardly surprising that many of these people reacted in anger and despair against the very idea of government. In the United States, Patrick Joseph Lee, an Irish immigrant arriving at the Boston docks, spoke for these people when, and we know this from his grandson, as he looked around he exclaimed, "If there's a government here, I'm agin it." In this country, that burning rage against governmental authority found expression in the myths surrounding the Eureka Stockade and Ned Kelly. In stark contrast, Kevin O'Doherty chose to seek better government than to damn the very idea of government. It's hardly surprising that many of the Irish came, like Kevin O'Doherty, to the view that only Home Rule could ensure that the sort of cataclysm represented by the famine did not happen again. In pressing the cause of Irish rule for Ireland, which gave rise to the offence of which O'Doherty was convicted, he was giving voice to the opinion that skill in the arts of government is of much less importance than identification with the governed, and that identification with the governed can only be guaranteed by ensuring that the government is of and by the people. Coming to Queensland, Dr. O'Doherty married Eva Kelly, who was famous in her own right as a poet, an Irish nationalist. She was Eva of the nation. He was encouraged to come to Queensland by Bishop O'Quinn, with whom he had been associated at St Vincent's Hospital in Dublin. O'Quinn enthused O'Doherty with his vision for setting up large numbers of struggling Irish families in Queensland, where he hoped they would become successful farmers. Dr. O'Doherty arrived in the colony about a year after O'Quinn. For 4 years, O'Doherty lived and practised medicine in Ipswich, then regarded, according to the Queenslander, as the intellectual and industrial capital of the colony. O'Doherty came to Brisbane in 1865 with the flowing tide of progress. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1867. By then he was one of Brisbane's leading surgeons. He was an early president of the Queensland Medical Society. He was an inspiring exemplar of the ethics of Hippocrates. He gave generously of his time and talent, carrying out extensive work on an honorary basis at Catholic hospitals in Brisbane. He was no narrow sectarian. He was one of the founding trustees of the Brisbane Grammar School. When the school was opened in 1868 by Governor Blackall, O'Doherty made a speech in which he was critical of the failure of the school to invite both the Catholic and Anglican Archbishops of Brisbane to the opening. That contretemps didn't stop him serving as a trustee and sending his sons to BGS. And so, while O'Doherty was in no way a Catholic bigot, he was a staunch defender of the dignity of those who had for centuries been denied that dignity as a matter of state policy. And he evidently thought that religion at its best should be a unifying force within the community and a wellspring of generosity and compassion. While he was in the Legislative Assembly, Dr. O'Doherty maintained a very busy private medical practice. Nevertheless, he obviously gave great satisfaction to his constituents as their representative for the seat of North Brisbane, because he was not challenged during the period of the great struggle that he and others in the Liberal interest conducted against the black soil squatters. After that bitter struggle subsided, when Samuel Griffith emerged as the dominant force in Queensland politics, O'Doherty sat for 12 years in the Legislative Council. In addition, He actively campaigned against avowedly sectarian attempts, such as those by a French priest, Father Paul Tissot, to solicit the votes of Catholics for a Catholic candidate for Parliament. I should perhaps explain here that when one speaks of the squattocracy in Queensland in the mid-19th century, one is speaking of a very different political grouping than the graziers and farmers who later came to be responsible for producing the agricultural wealth of the state. The latter group tended to be politically conservative, but they were decent, honest people. At the time of separation from New South Wales, the squattocracy who dominated Queensland's politics were speculators who had strong associations with shady moneyed interests in Sydney, from whom the taint of the rum corps had not entirely lifted. These black-soiled squatters, as they were known, were said by Professor Jenks to have laid claim to some enormous areas which they did not attempt to cultivate. Sir Stephen Roberts says that they sat down and raided the properties of respectable settlers. They may even have been drink sellers with no livestock at all. The distinguishing feature of the genus was dishonesty and locating themselves on ground to which they had no title. An unlikely friendship. As to the necessity and as to the possibility and indeed the necessity of better government responsible to the needs of the governed, Robert Atkin was of a like mind with Dr. O'Doherty. But of course, as I've mentioned, there was that division that had to be bridged before these different kinds of Irishmen could work together to build a better society than they had known in the old country. From his earliest time in the colony, Dr. O'Doherty had taken a strong stand against the kind of sectarian division that blighted his homeland. Speaking at a St Patrick's Day dinner in 1863, he said of the religious strife in Ireland that no blight more emasculating ever fell upon my country. This speech led to a letter to the editor of the Brisbane Courier, which asserted that O'Doherty had, quote, proved by his own argument that the best use to put an Irishman to was to expatriate him for his country's good. Robert Atkin was, as I've said, a Protestant from County Cork. I should pause here to say that ordinarily this circumstance could have been expected to make for a level of bitterness between Catholic and Protestant that would have made the friendship between Atkin and O'Doherty impossible. Cork is, of course, the southernmost of the Irish counties. Because of its strategic value, by reason of its proximity to France and Spain, the English in the time of Elizabeth I decided to plant a colony in Cork. It was the only county outside Ulster where they did so in such a comprehensive way. As a result, relations between Protestant planters and dispossessed Catholics was particularly fraught. They would remain that way well into the 20th century, when Cork was a particular hotbed of Republican sentiment. During the War of Independence, the Black and Tans burned Cork City. Michael Collins, the leader of the armed struggle during the War of Independence, was a Cork man, as were many other leaders of the rebellion. We can be quite confident that Robert Atkin had been brought up within a most virulent strain of sectarianism. As we will see, this blinkered background did not define him. Robert Atkin had met Mary Ruck, who was Welsh, in Dublin. They were married in London in 1864. They came to Australia partly for Robert's health and partly to seek their fortune. After some misadventures in business in central Queensland, Robert came to Brisbane, where he worked as a journalist. The register recording his son's birth describes Robert's occupation as editor. In 1868, he was elected to the Queensland Legislative Assembly as the member for Claremont. As I've said, he stood against the black soil squattocracy, and in this he stood foursquare with Kevin O'Doherty. In 1872, when a smallpox epidemic threatened the colony, O'Doherty introduced the first Public Health Act passed by the Queensland Parliament. The Act established a central board of health with authority over quarantine, vaccination, drainage, sanitation and food purity. He and the other medical men on the board campaigned, with little success it must be said, for the powers conferred on the colonial government by the Act to be deployed to clean up Brisbane's drains to prevent the reoccurrence of infectious diseases. Despite his initial lack of success, O'Doherty thus initiated in the Parliament the first steps of progressive development of healthcare as a project of the Queensland Parliament, and the idea that the health of the citizenry was a fundamental responsibility of government. That idea would, in the next century, see Queensland become the first Australian state and the first province in the British Empire to introduce a system of free public hospitals. Dr. O'Doherty's idea that the health of the community is a responsibility of the Parliament continued to grow in Queensland with a special zest. A completely free hospital service for inpatients and outpatients without the application of any means test was introduced in Queensland in 1944. In this, Queensland was a leader. While other states followed, with the assistance of the Chifley government, with the return of the Menzies government in 1949, all the states except Queensland reinstituted public ward charges to increase revenues. Queensland maintained its free hospital system, both under Conservative and Labor Party governments. The state retained its free hospital system despite its enormous costs because the governments continued to believe that politically it could not afford to change the system. The legislature in which O'Doherty and Atkin served passed laws for the building and operation of railways. In America, the railways essential for economic progress and prosperity were built on the initiative of wealthy individuals like Vanderbilt and Jay Gould. In the Australian colonies, the very different economic circumstances meant that these great works of nation building could only be undertaken by governments, and active governments at that. The Queensland legislature in which Atkin and O'Doherty served was also active in promoting public education. When O'Doherty's advocacy of state aid for denominational schools was rejected, he refused in protest to serve on the Board of Education to which he'd been appointed. And in 1873, he declined to nominate again for Parliament. In the longer term, the popular issues for which Robert Atkin and Kevin O'Doherty were advocates would, when harnessed to the strength of organised labour in the early decades of the 20th century, establish a social democracy that would be the marvel of the English-speaking world. And in 1922, Queensland became the first province in the English-speaking world to abolish the death penalty. Dr. O'Doherty also campaigned without immediate success for the establishment of the University of Queensland, which would from the outset include a medical school. Robert Atkin, whose health had never been robust, suffered severe injuries in a fall from a horse. It seems that he never properly recovered. His ill health forced him to resign from Parliament in March 1872, a little before O'Doherty, on the basis that he would be succeeded by the rising barrister Samuel Griffith. Robert Atkin died 2 months later. He was 32 years old. Can I say something now about the sectarian problem in the Australian colonies? It's probably fair to say that in the mid-19th century, the divisions between convict and free settler and Protestant and Catholic were the two principal sources of social tension between white colonists in Australia. The friendship between O'Doherty and Atkin rose above these social and sectarian differences. Their friendship and the achievements that flowed from it serve as an ongoing reminder that social and cultural differences that may seem eternal and unbridgeable can be bridged by education, goodwill and mutual respect. That it was possible to be a faithful member of one's church and to respect those of a different faith, or indeed those of no faith at all, was demonstrated by the very fact of their personal friendship as well as by their public alliance. This was not an easy point to make at the time. Indeed, so far as the sectarian divide was concerned, it was a real force for bad until after the Second World War. Robert Atkin and Kevin O'Doherty co-founded the avowedly anti-sectarian Hibernian Society of Queensland on the 7th September 1871. When O'Doherty stood down as president, he was succeeded by Robert Atkin. The assumption on which the society was founded was that decent people of goodwill could advance the common good while at the same time remaining faithful to the faith of their fathers. Shortly after Robert Atkin's death, the Hibernian Society erected a public memorial to his life, which still stands at Sandgate. The inscription on the memorial describes how Robert Atkin was distinguished in his journalism and in his work in the legislature by large and elevated views, remarkable powers of organisation and unswerving advocacy of the popular cause. His rare abilities were especially devoted to the promotion of a patriotic union among his countrymen, irrespective of class or creed, combined with a loyal allegiance to the land of their adoption. It's difficult to imagine that these words were written by anyone other than Kevin O'Doherty in honour of his friend, and one suspects that O'Doherty's willingness to continue in the colonial legislature until 1873 was at least in part an emotional response to the death of his friend and political ally. If I might pause here for a word for our sponsor, to say that the preservation of the monument of Robert Atkin should be a matter of public interest as a manifestation of our abiding regard for the values of inclusiveness in our community. On the occasion of the founding of the Selden Society, Dr. O'Doherty stated that its first aim was to destroy the most serious of all barriers to a complete solidarity among his countrymen, religious prejudice and party antipathy. O'Doherty explained that the Society was open to Irishmen of all religions. He expressed his agreement with the basis on which Queensland was to be governed and his hope that a similar government would be granted in Ireland. We are here, he said, thank God, completely independent of that discord among our countrymen at home. Here the British Constitution is not an empty name. Now it has to be said that he was overly optimistic in stating that Queensland was completely free of sectarian discord. And although it would be well into the next century before his optimism was truly justified, Queensland did break down the sectarian barriers more quickly than some other states. When Murray Gleeson was sworn in as Chief Justice of New South Wales in 1987, Gough Whitlam said to him that 20 years ago, someone with your name couldn't have been appointed to this position. It's significant that by 1967, 20 years earlier, Queensland had already had 3 Catholic Chief Justices, Macaulay and the 2 McCrossans. Notwithstanding friendships and alliances like those between Atkin and O'Doherty, O'Doherty's people were for a long time a highly visible and frequently uncomfortable minority in this country. The Catholic Irish encountered difficulties in finding employment and in business and in the professions. Difficulties in obtaining employment as solicitors in private firms led to the overrepresentation of the Irish in the Crown Law Office and at the bar. This overrepresentation at the bar would reach its ultimate expression in the late 1980s and 1990s when Anthony Mason, Gerard Brennan, Bill Dean, Mary Gaudron, Michael McHugh and John Toohey all served together on the High Court. My generation is the last to have experienced the ugly reality of the sectarian divide between Catholics and Protestants. When I attended St Columba's Convent at Wilston in the late 1950s, we used to engage in taunts with the children from the Wilston State School on the way to and from school. On occasions, when mutual taunts did not seem to be enough, we actually threw stones at each other. In the 1960s, there were still law firms in Queensland who employed only Catholics or only Protestants. But almost as if by a miracle, around about the time I began my time as an article clerk in 1974, the last vestiges of this sectarianism had gone. They just disappeared. No one cared anymore. I suppose these differences simply couldn't survive the comradeship of the Second World War and the general prosperity that ensued. For more than 150 years, however, the possibility of the peaceful integration of the Catholic Irish into the mainstream of Australian society seemed to be distinctly problematic. The process of integration took generations, and that's not surprising. The Irish were a difficult people to integrate. Over the medieval walls of the city of Galway on the west coast of Ireland was a sign. It read, "From the fury of the O'Flahertys, Lord protect us." We had O'Flahertys at my school. They were very wild. And with the benefit of hindsight, I can understand what the good burghers of Galway were worried about. Apart from being very wild, the O'Flahertys were also tall and attractive to women. I resented them on all these grounds. But once you got to know them, you realised that Wilston was a better place for having them. The problems of Irish integration were much greater than the eccentricities of particular families. The Catholic Irish in Australia, a quarter of the population at the outbreak of the First World War, were at best ambivalent in the support for the Empire in that war. Under the leadership of Archbishop Mannix, they were implacably opposed to the 2 referenda on conscription, which the Commonwealth Government proposed to support it. The Irish were sullen participants in Empire Day celebrations before the Second World War, if they participated at all, and they were often slow to stand for God Save the Queen when that was our national anthem. But after a few generations of awkwardness, this once abject people thrived in Australia as they've thrived nowhere else. Today we can look back and see the contribution of the Irish to the public life of this country is something worth celebrating. Some people in this room may remember their excitement when John Kennedy became the first Irish Catholic President of the United States in 1960. By that time, Australia had had 4 Irish Catholic Prime Ministers, Scullin, Lyons, Curtin and Chifley, and in the United States, Kennedy remains unique, while in Australia, we have added Keating to our tally. And so, in a socio-cultural sense, ODoherty's people have been so conspicuously successful that they are now an entirely indistinguishable part of the Australian people. In the 4 generations since the passing of Kevin O'Doherty, his people have become so successfully assimilated into the Australian community that it was for some decades, before the success of multiculturalism, commonplace to describe Australia as an Anglo-Celtic country. I acknowledge that this description was also a nod to our Scots and Welsh immigrants, and while we might not now describe our characteristic cultural mix in this way, the fact remains we are a better place for the migration of these people, just as we are a better place for each successive wave of immigrants who have enriched our cultural life since the war. Dr O'Doherty's later years. In 1885, Dr O'Doherty returned to Ireland, where for a time he served as MP for North Meath in the House of Commons. I understand that it's been said that in the Imperial Parliament he sat as the representative of the Irish National Party of Australia. He sat with Charles Stewart Parnell and supported Gladstone's bill for Home Rule. He returned to Australia briefly to get his affairs in order. A banquet was organised in his honour in Brisbane, but it was boycotted by the local establishment. The boycott is a salutary reminder that an advocate for the cause of the people was not necessarily popular with the people who mattered. The Brisbane Courier was strongly anti-Home Rule in its editorial policy. It exulted at the snub administered to O'Doherty by the great and the good. And so, even at that early stage, the Courier was astute to stake out its honoured place firmly on the wrong side of history. After the defeat of the Home Rule Bill in Westminster and Gladstone's resignation as Prime Minister, O'Doherty returned to Australia in 1889. He had been invited to run for a further term in the House of Commons, but declined this honour because it would seem of his straitened financial circumstances. After returning to Australia, O'Doherty served for a time as Secretary of the Board of Health, but he became blind. He eventually died in absolute penury at Milton in July 1905. He was 80 years old. Kevin and Eva O'Doherty lived extraordinary lives, full of endeavour and energy, pitted against extraordinary adversity, and in the end their lives were concluded in personal tragedy, even more sad than the untimely death of Robert Atkin. The O'Dohertys had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Each one of their sons died, one by one, in the 1890s. There was no male grandchild to carry on the O'Doherty name, but happily, Kevin and Eva are survived today by 2 great-great-granddaughters and their families who live in the United States. Eva O'Doherty lived until 1910. Her only surviving child, the daughter, and her only grandson lived with her. Her death in 1910 meant that at least she was spared the knowledge that this grandson would be killed fighting in the Australian forces in France during the Great War. The lessons. It might now be said that the story of Australia's Irish is the story of a different time and of a people that no longer exist. And that would be true, in that the Irish Australians are no longer a visibly distinct social grouping. That this is so speaks to Australia's success as a melting pot, the world's most successful multicultural nation. But there is also no doubt that some of us in this room are who we are because of the courage, ambitions and achievement of Kevin O'Doherty's people. The American historian Henry Adams, himself the son and grandson of men who had been President of the United States, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, described politics as, quote, the systematic organisation of hatreds. The history of Queensland, and indeed Australia, from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, showed that Adams was unduly cynical about democratic politics. In the context of the politics of the British Empire of the late 19th and early 20th century, no hatreds had been so thoroughly organised as the sectarian divide between the Irish of the orange and those of the green. British imperial policy promoted the policies of plantation and division since the 16th century. That policy was, as Conor Cruise O'Brien said, one of the worst things one gentle people has ever done to another. To this day, the sectarian division of the Irish blights the lives of those who live in the 6 counties. But even the most well-organised of hatreds can be disrupted, and the example of Robert Atkin and Kevin O'Doherty shows that that most powerful disruptive agent is friendship, and in a more abstract sense, fraternity, or as Robert Atkin's son Dick would put it, neighbourliness. The contribution made by Robert Atkin's kind of Irishmen, the decent, thoughtful Protestants, who saw the oppression of the majority of their countrymen in their own land as an injustice that had to be righted at home and not exported abroad, has been somewhat overshadowed by the numbers and the noise of Kevin O'Doherty's Irish and the O'Flahertys. But the alliance of these decent men claimed this country for ordinary people from the twin evils of the British imperial policy of divide and rule and the grasping land jobbery of the Bunyip aristocracy from Sydney. Dr. Samuel Johnson said that the Irish are an honest race, for they seldom speak well of one another. It will be obvious that I have enjoyed very much this evening's opportunity to speak well of the Irish, but in doing so I've also spoken honestly. Under the leadership of the O'Dohertys and the Atkins, both kinds of Irish embraced the practice of the value of fraternity that makes us one people dedicated to doing justice to each other within our nation. The truly revolutionary value of fraternity has flourished in Australia as a powerful antidote to individualism, which in its coldest version sees society as nothing more than a chaos of social atoms, free and equal to be sure, but bound only by prudent bargains, made ever more anxious by the stress of living in a stressful environment. In only a couple of generations, the alliance of Protestant liberals like Atkin and the Catholic Irish like O'Doherty would, without bloodshed, create governments of and by ordinary people that in turn promoted the growth of a society that became the envy of the world. The parliamentary achievements of these early Queenslanders are of abiding importance to us for 2 broad reasons. First, they show that even the most virulent cultural divisions can be defeated, at least in this most lucky country. And secondly, those achievements are strong evidence to counter the fashionable cynicism about politics and the democratic process. Disillusionment with the political process among our younger people is a special concern, as I know from my own experience. Each year, the brilliant young lawyers who act as associates to the judges, almost without exception, express their ambition to work in the field of human rights. This usually means working within the judicial process to improve the lives of less fortunate of our fellow citizens. In this regard, none of my associates has ever expressed an ambition to enter Parliament. Given the brutality of the political process, the polarisation of views that forecloses reasonable debate and respectful disagreement, and the eye-crossing banality of so much of what passes for political debate under the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle, one can understand the attractions of arguing for one's client's rights in the open, polite and reasonable atmosphere of a court, where decisions must be justified in public by comprehensive and coherent reasons. But the attractions of openness, fairness and rationality offered by the judicial process can't alter the reality that the grant of the positive rights that make life worthwhile is necessarily within the gift of parliaments. One cannot escape the truth that the positive rights that are the concrete expression of the great human and political principle of fraternity are possible only if taxpayers are willing to pay for them. Even the very greatest judges, even a Lord Atkin, cannot hope to give full justice to the expression of the value of fraternity in our public life. Judges can't impose or spend the taxes that raise the money to educate our children, to care for our sick and aged, or the veterans of our nation's wars, or to build the infrastructure necessary to our prosperity, or to conserve our environment. Within our constitutional tradition, it is Parliament that provides the process whereby that willingness is expressed. As E.G. Whitlam QC MP said, if we are to have economic equality of opportunity, which is the next stage in the advance of liberty, we must have effective parliamentary government and accordingly dispense with fetters on Parliament rather than contrive them. In the end, cynicism about politics is an expression of a lack of faith in our fellow citizens. It comes readily to those who have no idea of our history. If we know nothing of the heroes of the past, we can be forgiven for believing that the mediocrity of the present is our destiny. Those familiar with Australian history, with the story of the likes of Robert Atkin and Kevin ODoherty, for example, know that cynicism about the human capacity for fraternity and what our parliaments can achieve to give effect to that ideal is an unjustifiable form of misanthropy that we do not need and cannot afford. Thank you for your attention.
As many of you would have expected, we've been taken on a wonderful journey tonight from Ireland to Australia and back, through the famine, the predations of the squattocracy in Queensland, and more favourably the work of Atkin and ODoherty in areas such as public education and health, which remains a shining moment in our early history. ODoherty deserves to be much better known than he is. And Justice Keane has, in his usual clear and close historical survey, raised an awareness of him which I hope continues to grow. Judge, we have a cornucopia of gifts for you tonight through some minor misunderstandings, but I will just say our generosity of spirit. And I'm sure you'll enjoy some of them. Would you please thank Justice Keane again? The next in the Selden series concerns Barwick, his place in the Pantheon. It will be presented by the Honourable John Dowsett on the 25th of October in this courtroom. Please join us for refreshments in the gallery. Good evening.